the majority feeling of your creation is suffering, and the predominant outcome for the majority of your creation is eternal separation from you, I think you have failed. And if those two outcomes are what you wanted or desired or needed to happen in order for your own glory, you are cruel. You are not an all-good God. It's that simple to me. It just has to take into account foreknowledge, the omniscience of how things will end up, and the choice still to do that regardless. Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon, and today's episode is about omniscience. This is the claim that someone or something is all-knowing, not just foreknowing, not just can read our minds, but truly has all knowledge. Now, there's some better definitions if we were going to be having a more philosophical conversation, but I think for today's video, we all know what this claim is of omniscience, of all knowing. It is a claim that the Christian God makes, and I want to first indicate that in scripture, because sometimes the arguments can get into, well, the Bible doesn't really say that. I think in this particular case, the Bible is very clear that God does claim omniscience. So we'll get to those verses in a second. But is omniscience a problem? Does it contradict the very possibility of there being a God? Is there somehow some paradox between omnipotence and omniscience? Does it interact with our free will? Does it bring up issues with morality or the problem of suffering, etc.? Now, here is my confession. I think that a large amount of the arguments made from atheists on the issues of omniscience are weak. Not to be entirely dismissed, but really plausible explanations from the theist. However, I think there's a couple pretty problematic issues with omniscience in general, and I want to try to get into those today. I don't claim to be an expert on this topic. This is not something that I know nearly as well as I know other topics, so I would appreciate a lot of feedback from both sides of the aisle in the comments below. So where do we start? Let's start with what the Bible says about God in this capacity. Psalm 147:5 says, "Great is our Lord and abundant in strength. His understanding is infinite." 1 John 3:20 says, "In whatever our heart condemns us, for God is greater than our heart and knows all things." Psalm 139:4 says, "Even before there is a word on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it all." Psalm 44:21 says, "Would not God find this out? For he knows the secrets of the heart." Isaiah 46:9-10, "I am God and there is none like me. I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is still to come." Hebrews 4:13, "Nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give account." So this is just a small grouping of verses. I think that you could argue here, sometimes it's just about understanding our hearts or our thoughts, or that God has additional knowledge and insight into things that we don't know. But God's claim as creator, and especially that one in 1 John, is that he knows everything. From a philosophical standpoint, this is something that as one tries to construct the nature of what a God would have to be, it's one of these things. He has to be outside of space and time. He has to be all-knowing. He has to be able to do anything, etc. Now, there's a lot of silly paradoxes that you can get into with these claims of God. You know, the one for omnipotent is that can God make a boulder so heavy that he can't move it? Well, if he can't make that boulder, he's not all-powerful. And if he can make one so heavy he can't move it, then he can't move it and he's not all-powerful. Those are wordplay, semantics, paradoxes, etc. I don't think that they naturally destroy the argument. I do think that a lot of these characteristics of God that we attribute seemingly are illogical and or contradictory. But again, some really weak arguments. The weak argument, I think, with omniscience is looking at this from a perceptualist model. That means that we kind of attribute this meaning of all-knowing, that God has to be all-experiencing. So oftentimes you'll see something like, does God know what it is to eat strawberry ice cream? If he doesn't, he's not all-knowing, and thus God does not exist. I don't think that follows. I think it's unfair. I think that God can understand things without having to experience them if he indeed did exist. I think that a better representation of what the Bible means and what we mean when we ascribe this attribute to God of omniscience is a conceptualist model, which is really God knowing all true propositions and believing no false propositions. I think this is a much clearer explanation. It is a much fairer playground to be in. And in an example I've seen given to try to demonstrate the difference here is, I can know that my wife is taking a nap without having to take the nap as my wife and experience that firsthand. So God has knowledge of things. He understands all true propositions. I just want to steelman the argument here a little bit for the theist and not try to easily dismantle it with some of the wordplay and illogical paradoxes that are out there. Now, I think that there's something interesting to think about. I mean, one of the claims is that Jesus became man so that he could know what man had to face and still remain sinless, so so that he could be the perfect sacrifice. Well, if Jesus didn't get married and have kids, then I already have a whole array of things that I have had to deal with that Jesus did not. Jesus being a man when he was the Son of God in physical representation on earth means that he never experienced what it was to be a woman, and the problems that could come with that and the resulting sins that could come of being a woman in those problems and situations. Now, that's a bit of a different argument, but it's to show that there is some merit in thinking, can this God who hasn't experienced, again, going back to the perceptualist model of things, be relatable, be all knowledgeable, be understanding, be an example, etc. There's a lot of ways that you could take this. So I don't want to just throw it out completely, but I think there's a pretty good argument to be made from the theist in terms of omniscience that the perceptualist model is not necessarily fair or necessary. So I don't want to spend much time on it today. One of the biggest arguments out there is that, hey, if God is all-knowing, it really messes with our concept of free will. And free will is so important to the theist because, for one, it is the main excuse of the problems of suffering and evil. God had to give us free will so that we were not just robots that had to worship him. In giving us that free will, some people were going to abuse it, thus evil. That's the argument in a nutshell for how free will fixes the problem of evil and suffering. So if free will doesn't exist because of God's omniscience, we have a trickle-down effect of some major problems within the Christian doctrine. Now, I have an entire video on free will. It's a little bit lengthy and it's coming out this Thursday. So I'm going to try not to say too much about this. And I'd encourage you instead just to watch my video on free will when it comes out. It's one of my favorite videos that I've done. I cover free will from 6 different aspects and I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about that. So we're not even going to focus that much on free will, but I'd like to explain the argument why we're here. So here's the crux of the argument. I should be able under God's free will to choose A or B. Now, God already knows through his omniscience I'm going to choose A. I can't choose B because that would mean God didn't know correctly. So my actions are determined. If my actions are determined, there is no free will. This is the atheist argument or the non-theist argument to omniscience. Now, the theist has a pretty good line here, and they can say, listen, just because God knows what you will do, knowledge is not an action. Knowledge is just knowledge. I can know what your response is going to be without controlling your response. This is true up to a limit, but it's taking away a core concept here, which is that God as creator, with that foreknowledge, chose to still create. He is the determining factor that set things in motion. And therefore, he has predestined things to be. If he has always known I'm going to choose A and chose before I was even around to go ahead and create me with the understanding that I would choose A, then as my life plays out, there was never ever going to be any possibility that I chose B. It may feel like a free choice to me, but it's been determined from a higher power creating me with perfect knowledge that I can't do anything other than what he already expects me to do. Again, we'll dive into the varied responses of this and all of the implications of this on my Thursday video about free will, but that's some food for thought and some fodder for the comment section. And in a very interconnected way, this also becomes the same argument structure for my issues with the problem of evil or suffering as it relates to God's omniscience. So before we get into suffering and evil with omniscience, let's talk about some of the other arguments that are out there. The first one being the problems with prayer when you have an omniscient God. You have a God who knows how everything is going to end up. You also have a God with a will for how he wants things to end up. There's already a problem there between God's will and desire and him being an all-powerful God and an all-knowing God, and that those things aren't playing into this timeline of what will happen, God's ability to make anything happen. I mean, there already is a desired outcome, and that outcome has been promised and predicted to us with how the end of the world will happen, who eventually wins and who eventually loses between God and the devil. The fact that there will be an Antichrist and that he will indeed definitely lose takes away any semblance of free will, again, getting back into the free will argument here a little bit, for that Antichrist to do an action that results in a different outcome. That's on a larger scale of things we know are going to happen. I mean, prophecy in general is an issue because it's not just the knowledge of the thing that's going to happen. It's saying, hey, I know this will happen and I set the record playing. So in an essence, when Song 7 comes on, it's because I chose for it to play. I don't think it's a stretch to make that. So again, getting back to prayer, and I have an entire video on prayer. You can definitely check that out. Do our prayers matter if God already knows what is going to happen? Now, you can get into a lot of arguments here, and the theist will say something along the lines of, God knew we would pray, and thus that would be the outcome. But if we had chosen not to pray, which was our free choice, then he would not have been moved to do so. I see lots of problems with this, and I bring it up in my video on prayer. So once again, not going to address it here. There's an argument to be made out there about God's omniscience and moral responsibility, that if God knows what every person is going to choose, the good and the bad things that they're going to do, and chooses to create us, are we thus then responsible in either a praise or punishment fashion for those actions? Or does that credit in both ways just go back to the person who chose to create us, knowing the morality that we would have? Again, a lot of this has to do with the original argument of how it affects our free will, but these are subsets of that issue. So prayer, morality, another one would be that of divine justice. Right? How fair is it if God knows our outcome and knows some of us won't be Christian or choose to believe in him or have the availability of the option to even believe in him to then be damned? And this gets into all the arguments about, is there general revelation through nature, etc., etc. But I think it's still something worth exploring, that if God knows all of this, chooses to create us, is it fair that we are then damned if he knew that was going to be the outcome? And that's also part of the problem of suffering that we'll talk about in more detail. And then one last one, just again for some of the examples of where all this leads to, would be that of personal significance or purpose. If God knows everything that's going to happen, does this lead to some sort of fatalism, some sort of even nihilism, that we are just acting out in this play that God has already written? Now, I guess some of these arguments are a little unfair if you're just judging God on his omniscience, because a lot of what makes some of this possible is also understanding his omnipotence and him being the first mover or first causer according to the Christian tradition. So we're playing with multiple parts here. I just didn't want to have a huge video on all of the claims of what God is at once. I wanted to examine them individually as much as I could, but some are tied to others. But the main point that I want to make, and I don't think it's even going to be that long, is the issue with the problem of suffering or evil as it relates to God's omniscience. This is one of my number one issues with the God of the Bible as he is described and understood. So let's look at the concept here very quickly. You have a God. He is existing at some point, even though he's outside of time, by himself. He has not made angels. He has not made his heavenly host. He has not created the stars in this universe or anything else that he might have created that we don't know about. He has always been, and he will always be. This is very hard for us to conceptualize, in part because I just don't think that it makes any sense. But besides that, let's go ahead and attribute this eternal aspect to God. At some point, though, he invokes or interrupts or creates linear time, and he starts a procession. He makes the angels first. Everything goes haywire with Lucifer. He makes man. Here we are, X amount of years later, depending on what you believe. And things are bad. People die. People die horrendously. People are in suffering all their life. People have chronic pain, illness. They lose children. They lose lovers. They lose parents. They lose friends. They lose siblings. You can meet many people whose lives are filled with only suffering. You will never meet anyone whose life is only that of pleasure. Suffering defines this world. Our goal as human creatures has been to avoid suffering as much as possible. We have, if you look at the world around us, sheltered ourselves from all of the things that used to make us suffer. We have added electricity and plumbing and temperature control and all of the other comforts that have allowed us to avoid some suffering. We continue to advance in medicine so we can alleviate that suffering. We continue to advance in politics and negotiating the world we want to live in because we're trying to live in a better world, to have less suffering, to be upset less, to be happy more. It is the pursuit of happiness. I think that this is a common denominator that we can all get on board. Even those that are self-sacrificial are doing it for an expectant future pleasure. If at the end of a life serving God led to burning in hell eternally, I doubt many people would be sacrificing their brief time here on earth, chasing after him and sharing his message just to burn in hell eternally. There is an aspect we have to concede, that the idea of heaven with its streets of gold and its eternal pleasures and no more tears, death, sorrow, or sin, and being able to witness the Father's great glory on an eternal basis, as opposed to the concept of hell, whatever you want to define it, nothingness, eternal torture, finite torture, all of the misrepresentations, I think, that have been strewn out from the Bible on what hell is, you can have any of them. That's worse. That's better. That's why we want the better. That's why we want to avoid the worse. So suffering is bad. Suffering is everywhere. It is part of the human condition. And God, at some point, knew all of this before he chose to make it. If we just stop there, and if we really keep it in the frame of omniscience, this seems cruel. Why did God need to create us? Well, according to the scriptures, it's because he wanted communion with us. He wanted to be glorified. He wanted to be worshiped. We are made to reflect back to God his glory. That's our purpose. You can believe whatever you want about God caring about your every individual issue and all of the ways we've personalized a relationship with Jesus Christ, but the claim by God himself was for his worship, for his glory. And if this is the best that he can do for us to be able to reflect that glory back to him, I don't have to be able to be a God to know that I would have done that differently. That seems very man-made to me, that this world is the best we can get. If you're a God and you can see every possibility, picture that Doctor Strange moment in Endgame, right? He's seen everything that could happen. And that's limited to him just being able to look into the future, not necessarily control it. God could look into the future and could make any rule or rationality that he wanted. He could have easily created a version of free will that does not include the suffering. And if you don't believe that, you must believe that your God is extremely weak. Is this really it? Is this the best an all perfect, all loving, morally divine creature can do? I would argue no, and I don't have to have an objective morality as a standard to say that. We mentioned Alex O'Connor the other day, and he has a great example because the theist often will say, you don't understand, there has to be some level of suffering. There is a limited, necessary component of suffering for any creation to be able to be created with free will, to not make them slaves. First of all, I don't think God cares about making us slaves. He calls us slaves and servants of himself, and he endorses slavery, as we've talked about in 2 wonderful videos now. But assuming he even did care about that, and that's why he had to give us this free will for this minimal amount of suffering so that we could have joy, right? You don't know what sunshine is without the rainy day. All of these horrible things that don't excuse the real life situations of people holding their children as they die. But Alex takes it to an extent and says, okay, a deer is born, they're able to walk around, they feel pain, they get trapped, their leg gets stuck under a log, and now they slowly, through sheer terror and their family having to go on without them, are alone, starving to death, dehydrating to death. The predators are closing in, they're tearing bits and pieces off of this deer, and then finally going for the kill. From the second that deer was born until the second its life ends, there is nothing but suffering. Real pain to a real creature on this earth that cannot possibly serve a greater purpose of allowing for us to have free will. If God could have done that better, which I think is fair to say he could, how many more things could he do better in our human condition as well? So you have all the forethought, you still choose to go forward with this as your best plan after witnessing all the iterations of what could be. You either are limited in power or you simply don't care about the suffering that is going to be a definite byproduct of what you wanted to happen for your glory. If the majority feeling of your creation is suffering, and the predominant outcome for the majority of your creation is eternal separation from you, I think you have failed. And if those 2 outcomes are what you wanted or desired or needed to happen in order for your own glory, you are cruel. You are not an all-good God. It's that simple to me. And it doesn't have to take into account free will. It really doesn't have to take into account omnipotence. It just has to take into account foreknowledge, the omniscience of how things will end up, and the choice still to do that regardless. There's a billion arguments you're going to make, and you can make about, well, you're judging that those things are bad, and you don't have a right to do that, and you can't understand God's higher power. I'm just going off what the book says. God created us to glorify him, supposedly because he wanted connection with us eternally, but he gave us to our own devices, and most people then will not be with him, and will indeed suffer. So God wins. He gets his glory either way through his perfect justice, supposedly, and most of creation loses. If I'm a God with those properties, I can do better. That's not arrogance. That's me being able to envision a higher creature than the men of a few thousand years ago were able to envision. That's it. That's not me being better than the supreme being of the universe. That is me being better, more advanced, more data under my fingertips through sheer time and evolution than the Iron Age individuals who first created this concept. So that's where I want to leave it for today. It was really, I guess, an excuse for me to talk more about the problem of evil and suffering, which could be expanded on to no end. So I'm trying to categorize it within a few frames of omniscience. Let me know what your thoughts are. Let me know any issues that I missed. Let me know why you think the issues I have are not accurate. So subscribe and turn on notifications if you like this kind of content, these kind of discussions. This Tuesday, I'll be having a video where I react to inspiring philosophies, couple videos here recently on the topic of abortion and God. I think that one's pretty interesting and a little controversial. Thursday again will be free will, and then we'll have another longer Sunday episode next week. Thanks for being here. Have a great day and keep thinking.